Hey, what's going on, folks? In this lesson, in the SDL2 series, I'm going to be talking about building a layering system. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the system, why we need it, and we're going to do some live coding today. All right, so here we are, and before we start to code, well, we've got to start our design. So let's go ahead and do a little bit of design here. Now, the problem we're going to be talking about is something known as the painter's algorithm. And it's sort of a famous algorithm in graphics in how we talk about things. So if you're going to paint some picture, usually what you do is you draw the background, mountains, the sun, etc. And then you come and draw the midground, maybe some river running through here, and then eventually you draw the foreground here, the people that stand in front and are doing whatever. Okay, so that's the sort of idea, this idea that you render things from back to the front. And that's what we want to emulate in our layering system. Now, this isn't a perfect algorithm because you can sort of have this problem where if one section overlaps another section and that also overlaps, well, some other section, then you have this sort of very strange sort of transitive property where if A overlaps B and B overlaps C and C overlaps A, you get sort of this weird shape here. I'll just go ahead and show you an image of the problem here, and you can try to visualize what can go wrong with the painter's algorithm. That being said, though, for our simple sort of 2D game framework that we're creating here, and especially for building more tile-based games, we're probably not going to run into this problem. Rather, we would just have the ability or want the ability to just assign things to different layers and not have to worry about them. Okay, so let's go ahead and add a little bit to the sort of sample project that we have here. Now, if I go ahead and just build this project that we have, and then I'm going to go ahead and run it, we're going to see the Pong game running here. And I'll go ahead and bring it into the screen. So there's not too much that we have to worry about here. But what if I added a background sort of arena shape here? So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so allow me to, again, show you what we have here. I have a simple court here with a center, and yes, be marveled at my art skills here. So anyway, though, what we're going to want to do is go ahead and add that as a background image for our actual Pong court here. Okay, so let's go ahead and start writing some code here. And let's go ahead and open up our source, our main, where we are creating our objects. And we're going to take advantage of our EntityManager, which we developed last time to create these different game objects here. So what I'm going to want to do is create a new entity here, and it's going to be called the court. And we'll want to set up the actual instance here. I'm going to go ahead and just retrieve the created instance. I'll call it court as well. And then we'll want to set up some things with it. Now, we're not going to want to add a collider to the actual court. So this is where our sort of very fine-grained system works well, in the sense that we can set things one at a time here. So I do want to add a texture, though, and it's just called court.bmp. And let me make sure I'm doing this to the right object. I don't need to add a collider. I do want to set the dimensions, and the dimensions that I'm going to actually set it to are actually going to be whatever the window width and the height are. So we'll want to do that and set the position to 0, 0 here. 0 and 0. And let's go ahead and set our court. And let's go ahead and set the dimensions to, and I'm just going to borrow from this collider here the app width and the height of our screen here. Actually, I'll do this through app here, and we can get the window width, and through app we can get the window height. Okay, and then what do we have to do in order to actually draw this? Well, let's go ahead and check out our functions for handling the rendering. Well, luckily we have, since this is part of our EntityManager, just a render all function. So I'm going to go ahead and try to compile this again. Let's see if I made any mistakes. And it looks like just a spelling mistake here. So I'll go to line 311 and make sure I spell width correctly, and we'll go ahead and do a build. All right, now let's go ahead and give this a run and see what happens in our bin directory. And, well, oops, looks like I've got something sort of pointed to the wrong object here. So let's see what happened. Let me go ahead and scroll up. So we've created our object here. Looks like I set the reference not to court, but to ball in both instances. So that made a sort of interesting error. And there we go. So now we should be hopefully ready to go. And again, this is something we're going to want to think about with this framework or whatever framework you're building. And at some point, we're going to want to add some more levels of abstraction so that we can't misuse this API as easy. So with that said, let's go ahead and try to run our project. And now we are seeing something like this here. Okay, and this looks pretty reasonable. Now, again, we are having some issues here. The text that was here before that said left and right is actually getting overlapped here. So we can already see that that is one sort of issue here. Now, luckily we are rendering things in the correct order, but it is sort of our background object. So we might want to think about having our actual dynamic text, being able to set the color, these types of things, and so forth. Okay, now what I want to do though is actually see if this is going to hold true. That is, what if I had created these entities in, say, this order here? And I'm going to go ahead and just rebuild and rerun our application. All right, so let's go ahead and give it a run. And this time, now I'm just getting the sort of playing field here. So this is the exact issue that we're going to try to fix in our layering system. Depending on the order that we created the entities, we're getting different results as to what is drawn, because we essentially just got lucky when we had it in this order. But how do we ensure that we're not going to just rely on luck or whatever the underlying data structure is to get this right? So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just redo this change here so that we have the court being created first, but essentially overlapping our different objects here. Okay. So what we're going to need to do is perhaps in our entity manager is where we're going to want to open up here. And I mean, at this point, I don't need to do anything. I just want to be able to handle essentially in my render all function, and it will do the right thing. It'll just render all of the objects. So let's go ahead and in our include, open up the entity manager, and I'm going to do a split here. And in our source, take a look at the entity manager here. Okay, so let me just open this up. There we are. Okay, so whenever we create our entities, we're going to then want to assign them to a layer. And then essentially what I'm going to do here in our update all, and well, actually, since we're just dealing with rendering, for now, I'm just going to essentially render each layer in the correct order. Okay, so this is going to be the basic idea here. So I'm not really going to need to do anything in our entity manager here, but I should create some sort of layer type perhaps here. So let's go ahead and just open up a new file here. I'm just going to call it Layer.hpp. And there's a few different ways that we could do this. We could just have essentially in a enum. So let me go ahead and add some header guards here. This is Layer.hpp, define Layer.hpp. And again, depending on the types of games that you're building, you might want to make this configurable or the ability to add different layers. For now, let's just go ahead and make it really simple. A enum class and then the layer type. For now, we could just have one sort of background, middle ground, and I'll assign these values. Let's see, equals 1, and foreground equals 2, and end, which is sometimes what I like to do if you want to enumerate through different layers here. Let me give that a compile just to make sure that this is good. And what I'm going to do is include this particular class here, this enum class, in our entity manager so that we can create these different layers. Again, you might have a more extensive system than this, but I think this will get the idea across of what I'm trying to do in this video. As for instance, we might want to do something more interesting with, say, parallax scrolling, and then just sort of build on top of that. Okay, so with that idea in mind, let's go ahead and essentially force the user every time that they create an entity to pick where it's going to be. Is it going to be front of the background, middle ground, or the foreground? And then we can sort of resolve the issue of which order things get rendered in this sense. And again, if you need more granularity, you can just add more layers. In fact, I'll leave that as a to-do for you. Add more layers as needed, or consider making this a class or some data structure that you can add layers to dynamically. Okay, and that's homework for you to do here. Okay, so let me go ahead and just close this here. And then every time, again, that we create an entity, we need to set the layer. And I'll just make that L here. And then each of our entities, meaning each of our game entities, are going to need to store whatever that layer is. Okay, so let's go ahead and just make sure that our function signatures match here for our layers. So we need the layer here. And our new entity, maybe what we can do is just create a function so that we can dynamically change this. And we're just going to call it set layer, and it'll take in whatever the layer is. So the layer type, actually just pass in layer here. Okay, so let's go ahead and do a split here. We'll add our source and our game entity classes. Let's go ahead and do another split here for our game entity. And again, thank goodness for splitting windows. Let's go ahead and just add here sets the layer that we render to. Okay, void set layer, it's in the layer, and that'll be it. Again, this is a pretty small function. We could probably make it inlined or do something fancy here. But again, not necessary in this particular video series. We don't need to do much optimization, especially for this small game that we are building. So just want to sort of set folks' expectations there. So let's go ahead and have something called mLayer here to keep track of the layer. Keeps track of the layer we are rendering to. And it's going to be layer layer. Okay, and then we'll also need to include, as part of this, the Layer.hpp. All right, so let's go ahead and give that a compile. Let's see if we've broken anything and need to make some fixes. Okay, so we know that we've definitely broken the entity, or at least our use case of this, because we need to specify the layers. So I will revisit that. That's a known. Let's see, it doesn't like, it says create entity. We have no set layer function. This is a pointer, so we need to make sure that we call the appropriate function. Let me make sure I just spelled everything right and saved all the files, and then we'll give that another rebuild here. Okay, and I suspect that will help us out here. If I scroll up to where we compiled, yeah, it looks like now we just need to go back into our main function and then set all the layers, and then we will revisit our entity manager to make sure that we render things in each of those layers here. Okay, so let's go ahead and close out the game entities, and I'm going to do another split here to look at our source. We're going to need to include the Layer.hpp. That is included in our other game entities and so on. I'm just going to move it up here for now. And if I scroll down here, let me go ahead and add whatever our layers are here. Actually, this is a little bit messy here, so let me just close one of these windows. Let me close both the windows so you can see what we're doing here. So again, anytime we create the entity, we need to set the layer. And the court is going to be in the background. The paddles, I'm going to go ahead and put in the midground. The ball is sort of the most important entity. Actually, the way I want to do this is make sure that the paddles are... actually, I'll just put them on the foreground with the ball. There's a little bit of a weird error with our collision system where if you move the paddle past the ball as it's moving, it'll look like it's overlapping. That's fine for now. That might frustrate a player if they see that, so we might want to adapt our collision system. That would be sort of part of a gameplay decision to actually make, though. Okay, so let's see if I fix that much, if it is at least compiling. And it looks like it is, so we are in good shape here. Okay, so is our system actually working, though? Well, no, because we haven't really done anything with the layer. So we need to go back into our Entity Manager here. Let's go into the Entity Manager. And essentially what we could do here, we have a few different options. I'm just going to take the simple approach of just having render all do the right thing and sort of render the layers in order. We could have another render function called render specific layer. Again, it depends how much control you want to give users, and that could be useful as a debug tool to you as well. But let's just go ahead and set up things so that we can just render everything, and we know it will render correctly based off of the layer. And then we can always add more power here. And the simplest way to do this is going to be, well, to just search through all of our entities and, well, check which layer that they're a part of and render those ones first, and then essentially repeat this loop 3 times. Now, there is a little bit of expense here because we're iterating through 3 times. So would we want 3 different sort of layers where we're working with entities or looking for them? That could be a possibility. That might speed up some of your iteration time. Again, for now, what I'm going to do is just keep this simple. So let's just make it really, really explicit right now, and go ahead and render each layer. Actually, you know, as I think about this, it is going to make sense to implement this helper function to render a specific layer anyway. So just to make this a little bit clean, because I don't want to repeat any code. So render all entities in a specific layer. So void, I'm just going to call it render layer. It's going to take in the layer, and we'll just handle it that way. I actually like that. Now we give you sort of the debugging power you need if you want to call this function, but render all will work. And it'll actually make sense to maybe rename this render all layers now, just so that it's a little bit more clear what all means here, that we're doing all render layers versus just render a specific layer here. Okay, so let's go ahead and implement render layer. And essentially, again, we're going to run through this loop here, but I'm going to check, 1, if the entity is null, and if the layer is equal to, well, we have to get m entities, whatever the entity is that we are rendering, so the first one, and then actually call some function get layer here. So we'll need to add something to our game object to detect what layer it is part of here. Oops, I don't need this if statement here, but just like this, then we'll actually do the rendering. Okay, so let me go ahead and open up the game entity class here. And we need a getter function. Pretty much any time that we write a set function, we should write a get function here. So the get layer. And again, this is simple enough here. Let's just go ahead and implement the source here at the very end. Oops. This was returning the layer, the game entity, and get layer, and just return whatever layer it is. Okay, so now we have a way to do that. So let me go ahead and open back up our EntityManager. And let's go ahead and finish implementing this. So now it'll look for the right layer and then only layer, render that particular layer. Okay, so now render all layers is essentially just going to render each and every one of the layers. Now, there are a couple different ways that I can do this here. Let me go ahead and just get do the sort of simplest approach here. And let me open up our layers here just so that we can see all of them. Let me do a split here and the layer here. Now I can just sort of do these one at a time here. Layer, background, right? We're going to paint the background first. And then the middle ground, foreground, and then we're not going to do anything with the end here. I'll tell you why I have that end there in a moment. I just want to try to compile this. So again, this is all we have, render all of our layers. And it'll just do each of the 3 different layers that we have. So again, if we specify more, we'd have to add them and so on. So I think this is a good enough solution for now here. If I actually open up our main, let's just do one more change here where I have the render all. I need to do render all layers here. Okay, now let's go ahead and give this a build and see if it's going to work. And just a few mistakes here. It looks like I didn't capitalize layer here to match our type. And I'm sure you folks probably saw that before I did. And now it looks like things are compiling. And let's go ahead and give this a test. So if this is working, then it is in fact rendering the background layer first, the middle ground, then the foreground. So we should see everything running. And in fact, we do here. Now it's a little bit weird still because our text is white, I guess, so that's still a problem that we have to fix here. So there's actually an easier fix for that. I'm just going to go ahead and modify our hockey field or whatever we have here. But we would want to add some sort of different, I suppose, text colors to our dynamic text class. You know, for now, this is going to be fine here. So let's go ahead and give that a rerun. And now we can see everything on our Pong game. All right, folks, so there you have it. We have in just a few minutes or so a working layering system. And I think that's pretty cool that we have this actually working. Now you don't have to think about the order that you are rendering your objects, at least for these sort of 2D simple games or tile-based games here. I think this is going to be true here. So folks, if you enjoyed this video, if you've enjoyed seeing the progression as Pong has become more and more interesting with more colors, sounds, and all these sort of different things, make sure that you like and subscribe, especially if you're enjoying these sort of live coding sessions where I talk about some of the design trade-offs of each of the lessons as they take place, and you can just sort of hear my stream of consciousness and some of the design decisions that go into building a little SDL game framework. Anyway, thanks for being with me, folks, and we'll see you in the next one.